The wind swept through Dusty Creek that morning, carrying with it the smell of dry hay, sweat, and something far heavier: shame. The town's single street lay under the heat of a pale sun, and even the horses seemed uneasy, pawing at the ground as a crowd gathered near the wooden platform in front of the old hotel. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, some with curiosity, others with disgust, yet none dared look too long at the young man standing there, hands bound, head lowered, trembling in silence. He couldn't have been more than 19. His shirt was torn, his boots too big for his feet, and his eyes, when they lifted for a brief second, held the kind of fear only someone who's known hunger and loneliness could understand. The sheriff stood beside him, hat tilted low, expression firm but uneasy. The law was the law, he'd told himself. But deep down even he felt something about this morning wasn't right. Behind the sheriff, a heavy man in a dark vest counted coins into his palm, his lips curling with satisfaction. He was the merchant who had brought the boy to town, claiming the orphan had debts to repay. Nobody knew where the boy came from exactly. Some said he'd wandered out from the hills after his pa died in a mining collapse. Others whispered he was one of the railroad strays, left behind by men who didn't bother remembering names. Whatever the truth was, by the end of this hot morning, he was to be sold to the highest bidder to work off what he supposedly owed. A few women stood near the general store, clutching their baskets tighter, whispering prayers under their breath. Old men muttered that times were changing and not for the better. And just when it seemed like no one would speak up, the sound of a horse broke through the murmurs. All heads turned. From the far end of the street rode a woman in a deep blue dress and wide-brimmed hat, her posture straight, her eyes sharp as the edge of a blade. The townsfolk parted as she approached, her horse's hooves echoing off the wooden storefronts. Everyone knew her, though few really knew her. She was the widow who'd come from the east 2 years ago, settling on the edge of town where the old Miller Ranch used to be. Some called her Mrs. Gray, others the widow, but all agreed she carried herself like a lady far above Dusty Creek's small and broken world. When she dismounted, silence spread like a blanket. Even the sheriff straightened his back, tipping his hat respectfully. She stepped toward the platform, eyes fixed on the young man standing there, still trembling, still refusing to look up. "Sheriff," she said, her voice steady. "What's the meaning of this?" The sheriff cleared his throat, shifting uneasily. "Ma'am, this boy here owes a fair sum to Mr. Collins. The law says he's to be sold to work off what he owes. It's been approved by the county judge." Her gaze turned to the merchant counting his coins. "Sold," she repeated quietly, as though testing the word. Then she looked back at the boy, and something in her expression softened. Just slightly. "And how much does his freedom cost?" The merchant laughed, flicking his coin pouch. "Freedom, ma'am? You misunderstand. This one's hardly worth the trouble. Can't read, can't fight, barely speaks. He'll fetch a bit for labor, though. Maybe more if someone's got a place for him. You interested?" The crowd chuckled nervously, but she didn't blink. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out a handful of silver dollars, and let them fall one by one into her gloved palm. The sound rang clear in the air, sharp and cold. "I'll pay whatever he owes," she said. "And then he's coming with me." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The merchant's smirk faltered. Even the sheriff hesitated, glancing from one to the other, unsure what law to quote next. The widow held her ground. "Unless," she said, eyes narrowing, "Dusty Creek has begun selling souls now instead of cattle." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Finally, the merchant shrugged, snatched the silver from her hand, and motioned for the sheriff to untie the boy. "Fine by me. He's yours, ma'am. But don't say I didn't warn you. This one's got nothing but bad luck trailing him." As the sheriff cut the rope from his wrists, the boy swayed slightly, his legs weak from standing so long. He looked at her for the first time, really looked, and in his eyes was confusion, disbelief, and a kind of gratitude too raw for words. She didn't smile, only nodded toward her horse. "Come," she said softly. "You're free now." But the word free didn't feel real to him. Not yet. Not when he could still feel the weight of those eyes watching him from every direction. He followed her quietly, the dust rising beneath their feet as they walked away from the platform. People whispered again, their voices chasing after him like shadows. "Why'd she do that?" someone muttered. "She's always been strange," another replied. "Mark my words, that boy'll bring her nothing but trouble." By the time they reached the edge of town, the air had cooled a little. The widow mounted her horse again and looked down at him. "Can you ride?" she asked, He shook his head. She sighed faintly, then extended her hand. "Then hold on." He hesitated, his gaze flicking to her gloved hand, then back to the town behind them. There was nothing left for him there, only shame and the memory of a rope around his wrists. He took her hand. The horse started forward, and as they rode away, the sun dipped behind the dusty hills, painting the sky with streaks of copper and red. The boy didn't look back, but the widow did, and what she saw made her brow tighten. The merchant standing in the middle of the road, watching them go with a smile that wasn't kind at all. When they reached the widow's ranch by nightfall, lanterns flickered in the windows. The land was quiet, surrounded by acres of dry grass and an old barn that had seen better days. She dismounted and led him toward the porch, her footsteps firm. "You can sleep in the loft tonight," she said. "Tomorrow we'll talk about work. You'll earn your keep here, but no one owns you. Not anymore." He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to him with kindness that he wasn't sure how to answer. She paused, studying him. "What's your name?" He hesitated. I don't remember," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. Her expression softened again, just a flicker of something almost motherly, though guarded. "Then we'll find you one," she said. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, but it faded as quickly as it appeared. From somewhere out in the dark, a horse neighed sharply, followed by the echo of distant hooves. The widow turned her head toward the sound, her posture stiffening. "Get inside," she said quietly. "Now." The boy obeyed without question, slipping through the door as the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. She stood there for a moment, her hand resting on the porch post, eyes searching the horizon. Out past the line of trees, a small glimmer of light flickered, too steady to be a star. Someone was out there, watching. The widow took a deep breath, her expression hardening. She knew that buying the boy hadn't just saved him. It had stirred up something far older, something that had been waiting for her to make a move. And in Dusty Creek, no good deed ever went unpunished. The night settled heavy over Dusty Creek, and a cold wind whispered through the empty plains. In the small loft above the barn, the young man lay awake, staring at the cracks in the wooden roof where thin lines of moonlight slipped through. Sleep wouldn't come. His wrists still ached from the ropes, and the echo of that crowd's laughter haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the platform, the merchant's grin, and the sheriff's uneasy face. It all felt like a dream, one that could end any moment if he opened his eyes the wrong way. Down below, the widow moved quietly through her house, extinguishing the lamps one by one. She had taken in lost souls before, stray animals, wounded travelers, even a runaway child once. But none had unsettled her quite like this boy. There was something fragile about him, yes, but also something hidden, as if he carried a story too heavy for his small frame. She had seen that look before, in the mirror, years ago, when she herself had arrived in Dusty Creek, with nothing but a widow's black dress and a heart full of ghosts. The next morning, the light spilled across the land, warm and gold, washing away the night's unease. The boy woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and the creak of the barn door. When he stepped outside, the air smelled of dust and coffee. The widow was already by the corral, feeding her horses, her sleeves rolled up, her hair pulled back neatly under her hat. She looked up briefly and nodded for him to join her. "Hope you slept some," she said, her tone brisk but not unkind. He rubbed the back of his neck, unsure how to answer. "A little," he murmured. "You'll get used to the quiet out here. Town noise fades fast once you've had a night under the open sky." She handed him a bucket. "Fill the troughs, then check the fence line. The storm last week knocked down part of it." He took the bucket and got to work, though clumsily at first. His hands shook, unused to simple tasks that required steadiness. She watched for a while, then went about her chores. He didn't speak much that morning, only listened. To the wind, the creak of wood, the occasional call of a hawk. As the day went on, a strange calm began to settle over him. The land itself seemed alive, each sound part of something larger and older. He'd never known a place could be so still, yet so full of life. When the widow called him in for breakfast, he hesitated at the door before entering. The house smelled faintly of biscuits and old pine wood. "Sit," she said, setting down 2 plates. He obeyed, his movements careful as though afraid he might break something. She poured coffee into a tin cup and studied him quietly. "You've got a scar on your hand," she said finally. He glanced down. "It's from the mines," he said softly. "My father worked there. When he passed, they said I owed what he didn't pay." Her expression darkened. That man in town, Collins, he's been making money off lies for years. You weren't the first. He looked up at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Why did you help me? He asked after a moment. She leaned back, thoughtful. Because once, someone helped me when no one else would, she said simply. And because sometimes a person's worth more than the dirt folks try to sell them for. He didn't know what to say. Her words settled in his chest like a slow, quiet warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. But before he could thank her, a sharp sound outside caught their attention. The sound of hooves. The widow stood quickly and went to the window. 2 riders were approaching, their horses kicking up trails of dust. One of them she recognized instantly, Sheriff Daniels. The other was the merchant Collins. The boy tensed, instinctively taking a step back. Stay here, she said firmly, pulling on her gloves. Outside, the sheriff dismounted, his face drawn with concern. Morning, ma'am, he said. Hate to disturb you so early, but Collins here's filed a complaint. The merchant stepped forward, his tone oily and smug. That boy you took yesterday, he stole something from me before he left. Silver watch, worth more than the debt he owed. I'm here to get it back. That's a lie, she said coldly. You were paid in full. Paid for his labor, not for the things he stole. Collins's grin widened. The law's the law, ain't it, Sheriff? The sheriff looked uneasy. You got proof of the theft? Collins shrugged. Proof enough for me. The widow's eyes hardened. You're not taking him, she said. Not without cause and not while I'm breathing. The merchant's grin faded. For a moment, the 2 locked eyes. A silent war waged in the still morning air. Finally, Collins spat on the ground. This ain't over, widow. You can't hide him forever. As they rode off, the sheriff lingered a moment longer. Be careful, he said quietly. Collins has friends in high places. He's not the type to let go of a grudge. When the widow returned inside, the boy was still standing by the table, fists clenched. He's lying, he said, his voice trembling. I never took anything. I know, she replied. But that man doesn't need truth to make trouble. He swallowed hard. I can leave if it'll keep you safe, she shook her head. Running only makes men like him stronger. You stay. You'll work, you'll learn, and you'll fight back in your own way. Something in her tone silenced him. She wasn't asking, she was deciding. And for the first time in his life, someone was deciding in his favor. Days turned into weeks. The boy grew stronger, his hands roughening from labor, his shoulders straightening with pride. He repaired fences, chopped wood, and learned how to handle the horses. The widow taught him how to read the sky for storms, how to mend a saddle, how to live by the rhythm of the land. Slowly, he began to speak more, to ask questions about things beyond survival. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he found her sitting by the porch, staring out toward the horizon where Dusty Creek lay hidden beyond the hills. You ever think of leaving this place? He asked quietly. She didn't turn. Once, a long time ago. But places like this, they hold on to you. You run far enough and they follow. He hesitated. Who did you lose? Her eyes flickered, shadows crossing her face. My husband. He was a good man but too proud. Fought a battle he couldn't win, against men like Collins. They took everything from us. She paused, voice lowering. Sometimes I wonder if the land remembers the blood spilled on it. He looked away, unsure how to respond. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of something unspoken, a quiet understanding that 2 broken souls had somehow found the same patch of earth to heal on. But that peace was fragile. Late one night, the boy was awakened by the sound of a horse outside. He crept to the window and saw a shadow moving near the barn, someone leading a horse, whispering softly to calm it. He froze, heart pounding. The figure moved closer and moonlight glinted off metal, a rifle barrel. He ran downstairs, bursting into the widow's room. Someone's out there, he whispered urgently. She was already awake, pulling on her boots, eyes sharp. Stay inside, she said. He followed anyway, grabbing a lantern from the wall. Outside, the night was thick and silent. The figure was gone, but tracks in the dirt led toward the fence. She knelt beside them, frowning. Fresh, she murmured. He was watching us. Collins? The boy asked. Or someone he sent. She stood, her jaw tightening. He's not done trying to take you back. The boy swallowed, fear creeping back into his chest. Why won't he stop? Because men like him can't stand losing, she said softly. And because helping you reminded him there's still good left in this world, and that scares him more than anything. A cold wind blew across the fields then, rustling the dry grass. She turned toward the horizon, where a faint flicker of light appeared again, just as it had that first night. She didn't move, didn't speak. Only stared, and deep down she knew the battle she thought she'd buried years ago was coming back for her. But this time, she wasn't alone. Yet as dawn approached, the boy couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, waiting, watching and planning what would come next. And in Dusty Creek, when the wind carried whispers in the night, it usually meant trouble was already on its way. The days that followed were quieter, though the silence carried a weight that neither the widow nor the boy could shake. The land seemed to hold its breath. Every time a horse neighed in the distance or a door hinge creaked, both of them looked up, half expecting trouble. Dusty Creek wasn't far, and word traveled fast in small towns, especially when a story involved money, pride, and revenge. The widow went about her chores as usual, her face calm, her movements precise. But the boy noticed how her eyes often wandered toward the hills, scanning for movement. He could tell she was thinking ahead, planning, waiting. He tried to focus on his work, fixing fences and tending to the livestock, but unease crept in like an itch he couldn't reach. The idea that someone might come for him again made it hard to rest. One evening, after a long day mending a wagon wheel, he heard the widow speaking to someone out by the barn. The voice was low and rough, a man's. He stepped closer quietly, hiding behind the doorframe. "You shouldn't have done it," the man was saying. "Collins won't stop now and you know it." "I'm not afraid of him," she replied. "You should be. He's got friends from the city, men who don't ask questions when money's involved. They'll come for that boy and maybe for you too." There was a long pause. Then she said, "Let them come." The boy held his breath. He couldn't see the man's face, only his silhouette, a tall figure with a weathered hat and a rifle slung over his shoulder. He recognized him from town, a ranch hand named Holt who'd once worked for the widow's late husband. After the man rode off, the boy stepped into the light. "Who was that?" "An old friend," she said. "He came to warn me." "About Collins?" She nodded. "He's spreading lies. Says you ran off with stolen goods. Says I'm hiding a criminal." He clenched his fists. "Maybe I should leave." "You didn't ask for this." Her voice softened, but her expression stayed firm. "You think running will stop men like him? I've lived long enough to know it only makes them chase harder." She took a slow breath. "Besides, you've worked hard here. This place needs hands that don't quit. I need that." That night the boy couldn't sleep. He kept hearing Holt's warning echo in his mind. Collins had power, and power in Dusty Creek didn't always come from the law. The sheriff might have meant well, but when men like Collins opened their coin purses, the law tended to look the other way. By morning, he made up his mind to do something about it. He saddled the mare and headed toward town before sunrise. The widow spotted him just as he reached the gate. "Where do you think you're going?" she demanded. "I need to see the sheriff," he said. "If I tell him the truth, maybe he can stop Collins." "You think truth matters to men who've already bought their answers?" she asked sharply. He hesitated. "I can't just sit here while you take the risk. You saved me. I should stand for myself." She looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "If you're going, I'm coming with you." They rode together into Dusty Creek under a pale morning sky. The streets were quieter than usual, though a few early risers paused to stare as they passed. The sheriff's office sat beside the saloon, its wooden sign faded and crooked. Sheriff Daniels was inside, sipping coffee and reading a telegram. When they entered, he looked up, his face weary. "Morning," he said. "I was hoping I wouldn't see either of you so soon." The widow got straight to the point. "You said Collins filed a complaint." "We're here to clear it." The sheriff rubbed his jaw. "Ma'am, I don't doubt your word. But Collins claims the boy took something valuable. Without proof, there's not much I can do. He's got a paper from the county judge already." "What kind of paper?" she asked. "A claim of property," he said reluctantly. "He says he had legal guardianship of the boy, which means, under the law, any debt or stolen goods fall under his responsibility." The boy felt the ground tilt beneath him. "He's lying," he said. "I was never his anything." The sheriff nodded sadly. "I know, son. But the law doesn't always care what's true. It cares what's written down." The widow stepped forward, her voice like steel. "Then I'll find what's true and write it down myself." When they left the office, the boy could see the worry in her eyes, though she hid it well. Collins had money and papers on his side. They had only determination. As they rode back, she said, "There's one man who might help us. My husband trusted him once, Judge Halloran. He retired years ago, lives out near the old mill road. If he still remembers what fairness means, maybe he can make this right." They reached the old mill 2 days later. The place was quiet except for the sound of river water and the creak of a windmill turning slowly. The judge lived in a small cabin nearby, surrounded by stacks of old books and letters. When the widow told him their story, he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Collins," he muttered. "That man's been poisoning this county for years. The papers he's got might hold for now, but if you find proof he forged them, anything, his whole claim falls apart." "What kind of proof?" the boy asked. "Signatures, records, anything from the mining office where your father worked. If his debts were cleared or passed on to Collins unfairly, it'll be there." The boy nodded. "Then I'll find it." The widow placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not alone," she said. That night they camped near the river. The firelight flickered on her face as she stared into the flames, lost in thought. "When my husband was alive," she said softly, "he tried to stop men like Collins from buying out poor families. He thought honesty would be enough. It wasn't." The boy looked at her, the firelight catching the sadness in her eyes. "And you still fight," he said quietly. "Because someone has to." Before dawn, they rode toward the mining camp, a day's journey into the hills. The trail was rough, and the wind carried the smell of old iron and ash. When they arrived, the camp was half abandoned, shacks falling apart, tools rusting in the dirt. But one small office still stood. The sign above the door read, "Harlan Mining Comer Records." Inside, dust coated everything. They searched through boxes and ledgers, page after page of faded ink and crumbling paper. Hours passed. Finally, the boy found a page with his father's name. The debts were listed, but at the bottom in faint writing was a note. "Paid in full." His hands shook as he handed it to her. "This proves it," he said. Collins lied. But before she could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed outside. The widow motioned for him to stay quiet. Through the window they saw 2 riders approaching, Collins' men. She blew out the lantern, grabbed the papers and whispered, "Back door." They slipped out into the narrow alley behind the office, crouching low. The men dismounted and kicked open the front door. Voices filled the air, rough and impatient. "Search it all!" one shouted. "He's got to be here!" They ran for the trees, the widow's hand gripping the boy's arm as they ducked through the underbrush. The forest was thick, but the sound of hooves followed close behind. When they reached the riverbank, she turned and fired a warning shot into the air. The echo startled the horses, sending the men reeling. "Keep moving!" she yelled. They crossed the shallow river, water splashing around their boots. On the other side, they stopped to catch their breath. The papers were still safe, tucked inside her coat. The boy looked at her, wide-eyed. "They'll come after us again," he said. "Yes," she replied. "But now we have something worth fighting for." As they climbed the hill, the sun began to set behind the mountains, staining the sky a deep red. Dusty Creek lay far behind them, but they both knew the fight wasn't over. Collins would not rest until the truth that could destroy him was buried, or burned. The widow tightened her grip on the reins. "We take this to Judge Halloran," she said. "Then we make it known to every soul in that town." The boy nodded, though fear still clung to him. "And if he gets to us first?" She glanced at the fading light, her voice low but certain. "Then we make sure he regrets it." As darkness fell, the sound of distant thunder rolled across the plains. It wasn't from a storm. It was the sound of hooves, more than a few heading in their direction. The widow looked toward the horizon, her face pale in the dim glow. "He's coming," she whispered, and for the first time, the boy realized that saving his own life had pulled him into a battle far greater than himself, one that could change Dusty Creek forever. The sound of hooves echoed through the hills. Long before the riders came into view, the widow and the boy had taken shelter inside an abandoned line shack near the edge of the valley, its walls cracked and roof sagging but still strong enough to keep out the night wind. The fire they'd built had burned down to embers, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of damp earth. Neither spoke for a long time. They listened, to the faint rumble growing closer, to the horses, to the danger that seemed to breathe with the night itself. The boy sat by the window, clutching the papers they'd risked their lives to find. His fingers trembled, not from cold but from the weight of what they meant. Proof. For the first time, they held something that could end Collins's lies. Yet it also felt like the thing that might get them both killed before dawn. The widow stood near the door, rifle in hand, her eyes steady. Every few minutes she'd glance outside, scanning the ridgeline. "They're coming fast," she said softly. "Too fast for this to be a search. They know exactly where we are." The boy looked up. "How could they know?" "Because someone told them," he frowned. "You mean the judge?" She didn't answer, but her silence was enough. Trust was a fragile thing in a place like Dusty Creek, and even a good man could be tempted by a full purse. A gust of wind rattled the shutters. The sound of hooves stopped just beyond the clearing. Shadows moved between the trees, 6, maybe 7 riders. Their lanterns glowed faintly through the branches, orange against the dark. The boy swallowed hard. "What do we do?" She turned to him, calm but fierce. "We wait, we listen, and if they come closer, we move through the back trail toward the ridge. There's an old path that leads down to the river. Stay behind me no matter what happens." He nodded, though his throat felt dry. The silence stretched until the night seemed to hold its breath again. Then a voice called out from the darkness, deep and mocking. "Evening, widow. You've given us quite the chase." "Collins." The widow didn't move, didn't answer. "You've got something of mine." He went on. "That boy and those papers. Hand them over and maybe I'll let you both walk away." The boy clenched his fists. "He's lying," he whispered. She raised a hand to quiet him. "He always lies," she murmured. "Come now," Collins shouted. "You think the law's on your side?" "The sheriff won't touch me. The judge won't lift a pen without my say-so. You can't win this, widow, but I'll give you one last chance to make this easy." Her voice cut through the night like a blade. "You had your chance, Collins. The day you started selling people instead of cattle." The pause that followed was long, then a rough laugh. "You always did have spirit. Shame it's gonna get you killed." The boy felt her hand tighten on the rifle. "We're leaving," she whispered. "Now." They slipped out through the back as quietly as they could, moving low across the dirt. The moonlight flickered through the trees, just enough to see the narrow trail winding down the ridge. Behind them, the sound of horses shifted. Collins's men had dismounted. They hadn't gone far when a shout rang out. "There, they're running!" Gunfire split the air, echoing off the rocks. Bullets struck the trees, splinters flying. The boy stumbled, but the widow grabbed his arm and pulled him along. "Keep going!" she yelled. They ran until their lungs burned. The path curved sharply, leading toward the river below. When they reached the edge, the widow stopped to catch her breath. The water below shimmered in the moonlight. Fast, deep, and cold. "They'll see us if we cross now," the boy said, panting. "They'll catch us if we don't." She looked at the papers in his hand. "You still have them?" He nodded. "Good. Keep them dry." Before he could protest, she stepped into the water, the current tugging at her boots. He followed, gasping at the chill. The river rose to their waists, then to their chests. They moved slowly, each step heavy against the pull of the current. Behind them, voices shouted again, closer now. Lanterns appeared on the ridge. "They're in the river!" Someone yelled. "Go!" The widow hissed. "Don't stop." The boy pushed forward, the papers held high. The cold bit into his skin, but fear drove him on. When they reached the far bank, she hauled herself out and turned to pull him up. Together, they collapsed onto the grass, dripping and breathless. From across the river, Collins's men fired again, but the bullets fell short, splashing harmlessly into the current. The widow rolled onto her back, staring at the sky. "We bought time," she said quietly. "That's all." The boy turned to her, shivering. "How long can we run?" "As long as it takes," she said. By dawn, they reached an old cabin tucked into the hills, a place the widow's husband once used during cattle drives. It had been abandoned for years, but the walls still stood strong. They lit a small fire and hung their clothes to dry. As the morning light crept through the cracks, the widow finally let her guard down enough to sit beside the fire. Her face looked tired, older somehow. The boy had never seen her like that, still fierce but worn. He handed her the papers. "You should keep them," he said. She shook her head. "They're yours. Your father's name is on them. What Collins did to you, to him. It's your right to make it known." He looked down at the faded ink. "I don't even know if people will believe it. They'll believe what they see," she said. "You just have to live long enough to show them." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the land stretched wide and still, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. By afternoon, they saw dust rising in the distance again, too much for the wind alone. Collins hadn't given up. The widow stood, loading her rifle. "They'll be here by nightfall," she said. "If we leave now, we can make it to the old rail tunnel by sundown." "The one near Blackstone Ridge?" She nodded. "It's narrow and dark. They'll have to come one by one if they follow." They packed quickly, taking only what they needed. The ride to the ridge was long and hard, the trail steep and winding through canyons that swallowed sound. The boy could feel the tension in the air tightening with every turn. As the sun began to set, they reached the entrance to the tunnel. A gaping mouth carved into the rock, half collapsed but still passable. The widow dismounted, tying her horse to a post. "We'll rest here till dark," she said. The boy sat beside her, the papers still tucked safely under his coat. "Do you think Collins ever cared about the law?" he asked quietly. She stared into the tunnel's shadow. "Men like him don't care about law or justice. They care about control, and when control slips away, they turn to fear." He looked at her. "And you?" Her eyes met his. "I used to think revenge would fix what I lost. But then I saw you standing on that platform, and I realized saving someone means more than punishing anyone." Her words hung in the air, heavy and honest. The boy wanted to speak, but before he could, the distant sound of horses shattered the stillness again. "They're close," she said. They led the horses into the tunnel, the darkness swallowing them whole. The air was cold, the only sound their footsteps on stone. The boy held the lantern high, its light flickering weakly against the walls. Behind them, the echo of hooves grew louder. Collins and his men were entering the canyon. At the tunnel's end, the widow stopped. "We can't outrun them," she said. "But we can make them hesitate." She turned and pointed to a rocky ledge above the entrance. "If we light that lantern there, it'll look like we're camped inside. They'll think we're waiting to fight, and we'll slip out through the back," the boy said, catching on. She nodded. "If we're lucky." They set the lantern and crept through the narrow back path, climbing over loose rocks until they emerged into the open air again. The stars were bright now, scattered across the sky like silver dust. But the peace was short-lived. A gunshot cracked through the night, followed by another. They hit the ground, crawling behind a boulder. Voices echoed below, Collins shouting orders, his tone sharp and furious. "They're trying to circle us," she whispered. The boy's pulse pounded in his ears. "There's too many of them." She reloaded the rifle, her hand steady. "Then we make every shot count." The next few minutes felt endless. Shouts, gunfire, the smell of smoke. The widow fired twice, driving the riders back toward the canyon mouth. The boy clutched the papers, praying they wouldn't burn or fall. Then a voice rose above the chaos. Collins again. "You think you can hide behind that ridge forever? I'll burn every inch of this land if I have to." The widow leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. "He's desperate now. That's when men like him make mistakes." A sudden explosion of light filled the canyon. One of Collins's men had dropped a lantern, and the brush caught fire. Flames climbed the rocks, smoke curling into the sky. The widow looked at the blaze, then at the boy. "We end this tonight," she said. He stared at her, realizing what she meant. They couldn't run anymore. They'd reached the breaking point, the moment before everything changed, and as the fire spread, painting the night in red and gold, the sound of Collins' laughter echoed through the canyon, chilling and certain. The widow raised her rifle slowly, her silhouette framed by the flames. The boy could see the resolve in her face, the kind that came from loss, from survival, from too many years of fighting what others were too afraid to face. Somewhere deep inside him, fear gave way to something else, a quiet, fierce determination. The night was far from over, but one thing was clear. Before dawn, someone in Dusty Creek would lose everything. The fire raged across the canyon walls, crackling loud enough to drown out even the echo of gunfire. Smoke curled into the night sky, and the air burned with the scent of scorched brush and gunpowder. The widow crouched low beside the boy, her eyes fixed on the ridgeline where Collins and his men advanced through the glow. The heat pressed against their faces, and the ground trembled as a horse stumbled and screamed somewhere in the chaos. "Stay behind me," she whispered, her voice low but steady. The boy nodded, clutching the papers tight to his chest. They both knew this was the end of the road. The canyon, once their escape, had turned into a trap. Then, through the haze came the sound of another horse, a single rider approaching from the far ridge. The figure cut across the smoke, calm and sure, carrying a small flag made from torn cloth. For a moment, the widow thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but as the rider drew closer, she recognized the tall man in the worn duster, his hat tilted low over his eyes. It was the rancher, the one who had disappeared days ago after helping them escape the town. He dismounted slowly, walking toward the flames, unarmed but unshaken. Collins spotted him and raised his gun. "You again," he spat. "You should have kept riding," the rancher's voice carried across the canyon, calm but cutting. "And leave you to finish what you started?" "Not a chance," Collins sneered. "You can't stop me, old man. You think this land belongs to you, to her, to that boy? It belongs to whoever has the power to take it." The rancher stepped closer. "Power don't make a man, right? You forgot that a long time ago." For a moment everything went still, the flames, the shouts, even the wind. Then Collins fired. The sound cracked through the air like thunder. The widow screamed, but the rancher had already moved, diving behind a boulder as the bullet struck the rock near his head. He returned fire, quick and sure. The shot echoed and Collins stumbled backward, his weapon slipping from his hand. The boy watched as Collins fell, clutching his shoulder, eyes wide with shock. His men hesitated, suddenly unsure, the firelight flickering over their faces. The rancher stepped forward again, his gun trained steady. "It's over, Collins. Call your men off before the fire takes all of us." For the first time, fear crept into Collins's voice. "You don't have the nerve." "Try me," the rancher said quietly. Collins looked around. The canyon was closing in, smoke thickening, his men retreating toward their horses. He knew it was done. With a snarl, he turned and ran for the ridge, vanishing into the haze. The rest of his men followed, leaving behind the burning canyon and the people they had tried to destroy. When the last hoofbeats faded, the widow let out a long, shaking breath. The rancher holstered his weapon and walked toward them, his coat singed and covered in dust. "You two all right?" he asked. The boy nodded, though his eyes were wet. "You came back," the rancher smiled faintly. "Couldn't let you finish this without me." Together they watched the flames die down as the night slowly gave way to dawn. The fire had burned away much of the brush, leaving behind blackened stone and the faint smell of rain that followed smoke. It felt like the land itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. By sunrise, the three of them made their way down the canyon toward Dusty Creek. The town looked different in the morning light. Quiet, still, as though waiting for something new to begin. The widow carried her rifle slung over her shoulder. The boy rode beside her with the papers safely tucked in his saddlebag, and the rancher led the way. When they reached the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. News traveled fast in small places, and word of what had happened in the canyon had already reached the townsfolk. Some were afraid to speak. Others looked relieved, even hopeful. The judge stood on the steps, hat in hand, looking pale. "Is it true?" he asked softly. "Collins is gone?" The widow handed him the papers. "These are the records he tried to bury. Names, deeds, trades he made under the table. It's all here." The judge flipped through the documents, his brow furrowing. This is enough to clear your husband's name and more. Collins won't be able to come back from this." The boy looked up at him. "He shouldn't come back at all." The judge nodded grimly. "You've done this town a great service, son. Both of you." By midday, the sheriff announced an official order stripping Collins of his claims and reinstating the land to the rightful owners, those who had been cheated or driven out. It was a small victory, but it meant everything. The rancher helped rebuild the burned fences, the widow reopened her homestead, and the boy, for the first time in his life, felt like he belonged somewhere. Days passed, and Dusty Creek began to heal. The saloon stayed quiet most nights now, the miners and cowhands speaking in softer tones. The church bell rang again for the first time in months, not for mourning, but for hope. The widow planted a new garden behind her house, the boy helping her turn the soil. Each swing of the hoe felt like a promise, to remember what they had lost but not be defined by it. One afternoon, the rancher rode up the hill where the old oak tree stood overlooking the valley. The widow joined him there, a quiet peace between them. Below, the town shimmered in the golden light, small and simple but alive. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. He looked out across the horizon. "Used to. But I think I've done enough running for one lifetime." She smiled. "Then stay a while. Dusty Creek could use a man like you." He nodded, tipping his hat. "Maybe I will." The boy came up behind them, holding a folded paper. "The judge said they're printing the story," he said proudly. "About what happened." "About you both." The widow knelt beside him. "Then make sure they tell it right. Tell them it wasn't just about one man's greed. It was about standing up when no one else would." He smiled, and for the first time, There was light in his eyes again. That night, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the three of them sat by the fire outside the widow's house. The air was cool, the stars bright. The boy leaned back against the log, half asleep, while the rancher tuned his old guitar, the notes soft and low. "You think Collins will ever come back?" the boy asked sleepily. The rancher glanced toward the dark horizon. "If he does, he won't find the same people waiting. Some fights don't need to be fought twice." The widow nodded, her gaze calm. "The land remembers, but it forgives too if you give it time." The fire crackled softly between them, sending sparks drifting up into the night. In the distance, the faint howl of a coyote echoed across the plains, lonely but free. The sound seemed to carry something deeper, like a reminder that every ending was just another beginning. The boy closed his eyes, his heart light for the first time since he could remember. The widow watched him for a moment, then turned to the rancher. "You gave him a future," she said quietly. He shook his head. "He gave himself one. All I did was show him where to look." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they'd endured and everything still ahead. The fire burned low, the stars turned slowly above them, and the night settled gently over Dusty Creek. By morning, the ashes from the canyon had scattered into the wind, leaving behind only the scent of rain and wild sage. The town had changed, the people had changed, and somewhere out in the hills, the land itself seemed to breathe easier. For the widow, the rancher, and the boy, life no longer felt like a fight to survive. It felt like a second chance. And in that quiet corner of the old American frontier, where dust met dawn and hope found its way through loss, their story finally came to rest. Simple, honest, and alive like the heartbeat of the land itself.